I'm very happy that you're joining us via Zoom, via Facebook, and later on, once we've posted everything online, this talk will also be available on our website. Let me say a few things about this lecture series. We're sitting here in the Festsaal of the Diplomatic Academy. That's the very first time that we have an event here again, since February actually. And this is also where we started this lecture series with ÖFG Peaceful Change. We've had quite a few lectures already, all available online on the ÖFG website and on our website, of the Diplomatic Academy here. And we have focused on various subjects. Over the last couple of weeks, we more and more zoomed in on COVID-19 and different aspects of it. And I'm very, very happy that we have Professor Susanne Weigelin-Schwiedrzik here with us today, because when everyone speaks about COVID-19, then there's obviously the question about China. We find lots and lots of things on the news about what China allegedly has done, allegedly not done, and so on and so forth. And Professor Weigelin-Schwiedrzik can give us really an in-depth insight now about the domestic politics, also the foreign politics, foreign policies, diplomacy, and the global politics ultimately. Because with COVID-19, we should not forget there are already global implications of that. And this obviously is very, very much in line with our focus on the peaceful change, understanding peaceful change in international politics. I have now, for the first time since February, actually a physical person sitting next to me. It is quite far away, it's something like 10 meters, but I'm very, very happy that she's here with me. I'm sitting in front of yet another computer. And Susanne, a very, very cordial welcome to the DA, and a very cordial welcome to this ÖFG Peaceful Change lecture. And the title is China and the Global Politics of COVID-19. I'm not going to say all that much now about the speaker. She's a very, very distinguished scholar of East Asian studies, in particular China. Started to get interested in Chinese politics and affairs by looking at historiography, actually, so how China and how Chinese actors tell their own history, and then it's published very, very widely on China, on East Asia. She is a professor at the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Vienna, and obviously had lots of other important functions. So she's actually not just an excellent scholar, but she also did a lot of things in terms of running universities, so vice rector at the University of Vienna, for example. But I'll stop here. I don't want to talk all too much. I'm going to ask a few questions to our speaker. And Susanne, the question that I'd like to start with perhaps first is a question that some of our people in the audience may have on their minds. COVID-19, where does it actually come from? Is it China? What do we know about that? Do we know something about the timing? Was it mid-November? Was it December? Was it perhaps somewhere else in China? Was it in a different country? What do we know about that?
Thank you very much for the friendly introduction and for the very interesting question, which is obviously one of the most debated questions at this moment. I think we know that something is happening in China in terms of an epidemic going around since the 23rd of January. I think for quite some time, people knew that it must have started earlier in China, and that the government maybe did not communicate this with the population as early as it should have communicated. But most people outside China thought that maybe this virus wouldn't travel around the world. And so it took quite some time for people to adjust to the idea that this epidemic in China is a pandemic, and that we only know that the place where we could first observe it is Wuhan. So at the beginning, I don't think that anybody had the time to think about the question, how come that this virus suddenly pops up in Wuhan? And maybe only very few people who deal with China and who have known China for a long time and who know a little bit about the history of epidemics in China were astonished right from the beginning that this epidemic started in Wuhan. Because, for example, if you look back at the SARS epidemic, which took place in 2003, you might remember, if you have any memory of this, that it originated near Canton, more or less between Canton and Hong Kong. And this actually is, historically speaking, the place where epidemics in China come from. And this time we have an epidemic that sort of pops up in Wuhan. And so when I first heard this on January 23rd, I said, oh, interesting. This is so different. But I had no clue that something might be connected to this. As some of you might know, now people are discussing this all over the world. Mr. Trump said, it's a Wuhan virus, it's a Chinese virus. And then he went on and said, it's maybe originated from a lab, the Wuhan virology lab, maybe not. And then the Chinese said, no, it doesn't have anything to do with us. Maybe some people from the US military who visited Wuhan in September of last year, they might have imported this virus. And so the ideas about this are very, very different, and China is acting or reacting very strongly to any attempt to say, why don't we try to find out where this virus actually comes from, because then we understand the virus better. We can take measures that are maybe more efficient than what we are doing at this time, and we can learn from this situation for the future. But Chinese are not very happy about this. Why are they not very happy? Because the US Americans are already going to court against China, saying that China is responsible for the pandemic and things like this. So if you ask me personally and want a personal answer to this, I must say that I did quite a lot of research on this question together with a virologist who helped me in reading all the virology papers that are related to this question, including all the virology papers that the people from Wuhan actually published during the last years. So he did this part and I did the other part. So what is our conclusion? Our conclusion is that there is quite some evidence that this pandemic originated from a lab accident at the Wuhan virology lab. And this does not mean that this virus that is haunting us is a construct, is an artificial virus. We are not saying this. We don't have any clue on this. And we couldn't do any research on the virus itself in order to find out whether it's a construct or not. But we looked at all the evidence we could find in order to come to a conclusion to say there is a possibility of an accident. So why do we say this? First of all, we don't have patient zero. How come we don't have patient zero, although the epidemic was actually quite a local event at the beginning? Secondly, the so-called patient zero that was given to us is someone who never was at this sort of wild enemy market that everybody was talking about at the beginning of the epidemic. The lab I'm talking about is a so-called P4 lab, which is a very, very high security lab. It was built together in a cooperation with the French government, but French virologists are not very active in this lab anymore. And quite interestingly, and you might have read about this, the US Americans actually put a lot of money into this lab, which was one reason why people from the US Embassy would come and visit this lab on a regular basis. And they actually started criticizing that this lab was a very high risk security lab, but the procedures that are defined and agreed upon internationally were not followed according to their observation. And they sent messages to Washington and asked Washington for help, because if you do virus research, and this is something we do have to do in order to understand what kind of virus is actually haunting us, for example, at this moment. So if you do research on virus, it's extremely risky. And it's so risky that the US controlling agency actually said we are not allowed to do any kind of research on this topic in the US, which is the reason why they sent the money to the Wuhan virology lab in order for them to do the research. Because obviously, if something happened, they thought it would happen in China and not in the US. So the fact that this research is so extremely risky is yet another indication that something might have happened unintentionally. A third very interesting thing we found is that the person who is actually the spokesperson for the lab at this moment, it's the party secretary of the lab. He published an article in an English language journal in September of 2019, saying that China is having enormous difficulties in actually preserving the standards of a high-risk security lab. This article was published in September 2019, and many people who actually do research on the history of this virus come to the conclusion that the virus first appeared in 2019 September. Very interesting fact. And last but not least, one might say that, for example, if you look through all kinds of files from China, you will find out that people were condemned during the last years because they sold animals on the wild market that were actually animals that had been treated in labs for experimental reasons. So these people sort of work on all kinds of animals in the context of doing research on virus. And they finally come to the conclusion that this is such a rare animal that people might want to have it, and they sell it on the wild animal market. And we have evidence of this. And all this shows that something was not going in a direction that was defined by all the kinds of rules and regularities that you should know when you run a high-risk security lab. That's the reason why we think that the possibility is very high that this virus actually originated from a lab accident. And this does not imply, and I say this again and again, that this virus has to be a construct or an so-called artificial virus. It can be a totally normal, natural virus that escaped from the lab.
That was a really in-depth answer to this question, and we often hear that now debated on the media, and debated, I think, oftentimes in very specific manner. The next question, the next theme that I'd be interested in is when we look at Chinese domestic politics. What does the management of this crisis tell us about Chinese domestic politics? Because there are oftentimes all kinds of hypotheses that say the grip of the regime is getting stronger, others say it's getting weaker. What does the management of this crisis tell us about Chinese domestic politics?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. I think at the beginning of the crisis, many people thought that this would be the end of the authoritarian regime in China. And when I was interviewed at the time, I said, be careful. China has already gone through many, many different crises, and the regime has been very resilient in actually coping with these crises. However, we also realized right from the beginning that the Chinese elite was under enormous pressure, even at a moment when the number of sick people was not really very big. So we always thought, you know, it must be something weird here, because the reaction on the side of the Chinese elite was very prominent and crisis driven. We saw that the elite was actually splitting up into different factions, and that people were so scared by this crisis that they actually tried to not unite and go into unanimous action, but that they were competing for the best way to get out of that crisis already. And so we saw that the central elite in China was splitting into different sort of factions, and we saw that there was quite a lot of competition and conflict between the local elite in Wuhan and the local elite in Hubei on the one hand side, and the central elite on the other hand side. So we were sort of quite astonished to see that the problem didn't seem to be enormously big, but the reaction in Beijing and the reaction in Wuhan was as if something really big was happening. So this tells us that at the moment we were informed that the crisis was in the process of developing. The elites in China already knew that they were dealing with something really bad. So much worse than anything that we were actually able to observe at this specific moment. Then secondly, many people thought, you know, like the lockdown of Wuhan is something that you can only do in an authoritarian regime. And as we all know of now, that it is not the regime that actually drives the elites to take certain measures, but it's the virus that drives the elites to take certain measures. And in no political regime can survive a situation where the number of deaths goes up and up and up and up, and the number of people who are sick are not only enormously high, but the proportion of those who are sick who die actually grow too much. And as you can see, all political regimes, no matter whether we look at an authoritarian regime like China or a democratic regime like the US or democratic regimes in Europe, we are all confronted with a deep legitimacy crisis, and the elites in all countries are under enormous pressures to show that they are able to manage this crisis. And China is already a few weeks ahead of us. And as you might have observed and read in the newspapers or wherever, China sort of learned that they have to define the master narrative on this pandemic. So everybody around the world should understand what we are going through in terms of the narrative that the Chinese actually invented for this whole thing. And the most important aspect of their narrative is that they are trying to make us believe in a success story. And so all kinds of ingredients have to be put into this story so that we can read the story as a success story. So for example, if you look at the relationship between people who were infected on the one hand side and people who died on the other hand side, you will see that China is the country that is actually, you know, only topped by Taiwan and by Hong Kong and maybe by Macau. In Macau, we have 45 people infected. No one ever died of this disease. So Macau is in an extremely good position. But except for that, I think China counts among those countries that by their numbers can actually make us believe that everything went extremely well. Unfortunately, I must say that we don't believe in the numbers that are given from China. I'm so interested in this topic that I actually compare the numbers on a daily basis, and it's very interesting that I hear from my friends and colleagues in China that there are still people who are infected, that there are still clusters, and that sort of the epidemic in China is sort of moving from one part of the country to the other. And very interestingly, the numbers don't really grow. And then somebody said, oh, somehow this 3,000 something dead people cannot be right. And then they decided, okay, we add 50%. And they added exactly 50%. And I think this is a way how the people who are responsible of the numbers tell us who watch them doing this, that they're actually not telling us the truth. They are so obviously making up the numbers in order to be able to write their success story that nobody can trust them. And I think this is the biggest problem that the political regime has in China at this moment. People don't trust them. And the economy can't really recover. People don't really dare to go back to their working places. People stay at home because they have the feeling that this government cannot be trusted. They're not telling their population the truth. And so that is the reason why the truth is exchanged on social media between the different people, and they develop their own truth, and the government reiterates time and again its success story. But according to what I know about China, the number of people who really believe in this success story is quite limited.
I think the point about the narrative is a very important one, and there's probably a domestic side to that, and there's probably also an international side to that. So Chinese diplomacy tries to assert a certain story internationally as well. Can you explain to us a little bit more, what is that international narrative? How successful do you think the government is, or how successful do you think Chinese diplomacy is, public diplomacy perhaps, is in making others believe that narrative?
As soon as we talk about the international side of this problem, we cannot talk about China without looking at other countries in the world, especially at the US, because as a matter of fact, we see a competition between the US and China in form of the competition of two narratives. And the narrative that Mr. Trump and Mr. Pompeo invented is the narrative that China is responsible for everything we are going through, and that China should be held responsible, and that China should pay for all the losses that we have around the world. Because if China could be forced to actually take over the responsibility for this crisis, and if China could be forced to have to pay for this, then this would actually help the US elites, and especially Mr. Trump and his followers, to slow down the economic growth of China. And this is what actually Mr. Trump is hoping for. So one must say that, interestingly enough, I think the invention of a narrative on the coronavirus started from Washington and not from Beijing. It was only because Washington was trying to invent this coronavirus story that people in Beijing realized that they had to actually come up with their story and compete with the Washington story in order to dominate the worldwide discourse on the coronavirus pandemic. And so one has to say that, not only this authoritarian state in China has a major legitimacy crisis, has a major trust crisis, has a major economic crisis to deal with, but also the government in Washington obviously has a major problem to solve. And they both use the same method, which is actually inventing their divergent versions of what this whole pandemic is about. And one of the key questions is actually the first question we talked about, is the question, did this pandemic originate from China? So what is my answer? According to my research, the research on the coronavirus, including the one that is haunting us at this moment, has long been internationalized. It's not a Chinese research or a US-American research, it's a worldwide research. And don't think that we don't need this research. We do need this research. And very interestingly, as I just said, as the US-American control agencies came to the conclusion that doing this kind of research was much too dangerous in the US, they decided to put money into that research lab in Wuhan that could actually do the best research on this. Right? And so this means that these two countries were actually, by their research, part and parcel of one story and not of two stories. And we also know that, for example, the Center of Disease Control, which is sort of an institution we have all over the world that should be able to control these kind of epidemics and pandemics. Well, the Center of Disease Control in the US and in China used to be linked to each other very closely, up to the point that people from the US would sit in the Center of Disease Control in China until recently. Until when? Until Mr. Trump decided that he didn't want this anymore. Right? Very interesting situation. We also know that already in November, the Center of Disease Control in Beijing informed the Center of Disease Control in Washington. It was not in Washington, I think it was in Los Angeles, but their sort of counterpart in the US. They informed them and said, there is a very strange pneumonia going on in China. We should do something together in order to prevent this from expanding into a pandemic. So with other words, up until quite recently, up until November of 2019, these two countries were in very, very close communication with each other. I hadn't known before, but I know now that the US has a medical intelligence service. The medical intelligence service already informed the Trump administration that that something was going on in China that could be harmful for the US, and that one should closely cooperate with China in order to overcome this possibility. No answer. So with other words, we actually are now in a situation which I call the new Cold War. Why? Because all the kinds of collaborations and cooperations that had developed between the US and China during the last 20 to 30 years have been sort of slowing down and actually interrupted since the year 2019. And now we are in a situation where those two big powers that have, an enormous influence on what is going on in the world, these two powers are not willing to collaborate anymore. They're actually in competition and in conflict with each other. And that is the reason why I think we should talk about the new Cold War.
Those are sobering words. And I have a question from Professor Hubert Isak, who's also part of our research network on peaceful change from the University of Graz. And he wonders what the European Union can contribute to all of that. So can it somehow mediate between these two sides? Can it perhaps contribute to focusing things more on global health issues, on in this case now on COVID-19, rather than on the big diplomatic tensions that seem to emerge from the higher echelons of foreign policy and diplomacy?
A very tough question. Because if we observe what has been going on during the last 3, 4, 5 months, we see that tension and confrontation is becoming more and more tense. And if we look at the situation in East Asia, we see that many countries in each Asia, including regions like Hong Kong, including Taiwan, had learned sort of to live with a difficult but more or less ambiguous situation. They could have good relations with China and at the same time could have good relations with the US. Look at Japan. Japan has enormously strong economic ties with China, and at the same time, of course, is very strongly politically connected to the US. Look at Australia, enormously strong economic ties with China, but of course, politically speaking, very much an ally of the US. And now we see in that region, it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work anymore. You either have to be on this side or you have to be on that side. So in this situation, I think it is so important that Europe understands how dangerous this is, that you can't just look into, a different corner and overlook what is going on in this corner. But what is happening in East Asia at this moment is going to be what is happening in the world within the next years to come. So Europe actually is in a position that it could act as a mediator between the two. However, Europe is unfortunately also contaminated by the political virus of this competition between China and the US, which implies that we will see more and more European countries either taking this side or taking that side. And this implies, with regard to China, that the number of people who have the patience to continue to talk and to continue to try to have an influence on decision makers in China is unfortunately going down and down and down, whereas the number of people who do not want to have anything to do with China is growing, growing, growing. So historically speaking, if we look back at a similar situation, for example, in the 1930s, in the 20th century, when Japan was preparing to go to war, one of the really big problems at the time was that nobody really was able and willing to talk to the elites in Japan, who, before they started the war, were quite unsure in which direction to go. And the situation had not come to a point where the elite had already united behind the idea that we are going to go to war against China, for example. And in this situation, nobody talked to Japan. Japan was extremely isolated, and Japan developed its strategy towards East Asia, Southeast Asia, and finally the rest of the world, very much in isolation. And I think Europe should understand that we should at least try not to isolate China and to continue to talk to China, because we are the only place in the world that has a chance to talk to both sides.
With that, we're basically to our bridge to quite a few questions that were asked on Zoom, on Facebook, that are about the current balance of power, that are about the concept of the peaceful rise of China. And these questions obviously are quite important now for the research network that we are part of. Probably quite interesting and very important for the audience as well. I mean, there are all kinds of dire predictions by some international relations scholars. Long cycle theorists, for instance, they suggest about every 100 years or so, there is a hegemonic conflict, there is a hegemonic war even. Some go even that far. Others, and I squarely, and we as a research network, I think we squarely side with them, as it really depends on agency, it depends on how politics, how global politics, how diplomacy shapes up. But what effects does COVID-19 now have? So before the crisis, already quite clearly, there were problems, there were rising tensions. There seem to be more now. At the same time, perhaps, it shows us yet again that globalization comes with global problems. So one has to act globally. And that can only be done through cooperation. And in our age, that means probably first and foremost, multilateralism. Susanne, how do you see that? Do we inadvertently move away now from peaceful rise and towards a more dangerous trajectory? Or are there still opportunities to reinvigorate cooperation, and what opportunities could those be?
Well, from my point of view, we have to look at the situation in the sense that at this moment, we have a very sort of competitive relationship between China and the US, as I just said. And this competitive relationship is very interestingly a relationship where the two different countries develop very similar strategies. So, for example, the recent National People's Congress that only started on Friday, right? Mr. Xi Jinping gave a speech in which he talked about multilateralism. And so, interestingly, now it's a state-run economy like China that advocates free trade, that advocates multilateralism, whereas the country that is like the country of free trade and multilateralism, the US, is actually a country that sort of doesn't want to talk about multilateralism and free trade so much anymore. But on the other hand, quite interestingly, we see that the US is actually decoupling from the Chinese economy in terms of a constant process that has been going on for several years now. So if you had asked me this question like 5 years ago, I would have said, you know, the economies of China and the US are so interrelated that the two countries cannot go to war against each other. And if you ask people in the US, they would say, you know, no war between China and the US because we are so closely linked to each other economically that if we went to war against each other, then we would be in a very difficult situation. If you ask people in China, they would give you the exact same answer. But now we see the two economies decoupling. And this process started from the US. And interestingly, Xi Jinping said in his recent speech on the National People's Congress in China that he thinks that now China really has reasons to develop an inward strategy of economic development. They have been saying, you know, we want to stress the internal market and we want the internal market to be more important for our economic development for many, many years. But as a matter of fact, I mean, they developed the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an outgoing strategy. And with regards to so many things, it is like not real that they wanted to develop their own market. But now they say we have reasons that we need to prepare for the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario, according to the assessment of the leadership in China, is a decoupling of China from the US and from the rest of the Western world. So this implies that here they are already making preparations and that they suddenly realize that they have to develop the forces of their own market, and they say they have to guarantee that everything the population in China needs can be produced in China. So all this shows that the situation has changed dramatically. And this kind of dramatic change actually sort of has been developing more or less since the Trump administration took over, but it has definitely come to a point, you know, like in January of 2020, where now they openly say, if I want to translate to you what they're saying. I can only say they are saying, we are preparing for the worst case scenario, which is war. And we are doing this because the US is preparing for the worst case scenario, and this is war. And so I think this is a situation by which we are confronted in this moment. And we have to understand how dangerous this situation is. And Europe is one of the very, very few players in this world that maybe could make a difference.
Then I have a few questions by the audience that relate to economics, broadly speaking. So for instance, what are the implications of the current situation on the Belt and Road Initiative? Let me perhaps just add to that a bigger dimension. Economists, they have started to debate the concept of deglobalization. So economists have always looked at globalization in terms of more trade, more financial transactions and all of that, so really on the economic side. But they have started, even before now this COVID-19 crisis, they've started to question whether that is still going on like that. Some of them, they contend that global trade has peaked, that global finance has peaked, and that in turn is going to lead to deglobalization processes. You've talked a little bit about decoupling beforehand between the US and China. So perhaps in very stark terms, the question, are we experiencing deglobalization at the moment?
According to my understanding, we are actually already going through a process of deglobalization. And the decoupling I was just talking about is only sort of the most obvious aspect of deglobalization. Because, first of all, I think that the world would have never reached this level of globalization without China being at the very center of this globalization process. And of course, the US always played an enormously important role in this globalization process between China and the rest of the world, and of course between China and the US. So with the growing distrust between China and the US is decoupling. And of course, we in Europe also realize, for example, that we cannot produce any antibiotics without China giving us the basic materials for this. So this, of course, implies in a situation where a country goes to war against another country, for example, against the US, which is closely related to us in Europe, then what do you think China would do? Do you think China would continue to send all these goods that we need in order to survive to Europe, if Europe is closely connected to the US? No. So this means with the growing distrust between the US and China, the supply chains that are so strong that we can't, for example, produce certain medication without everything coming from China, then in this situation, suddenly people in Europe will start to think and say, can we continue to be so much reliant on what is being produced in China? No. So this means with the decoupling of the US, we also will see that there is a decoupling process from between Europe and China. If you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, I think many people sort of thought that this is something that the Chinese want because they need to export their capital because they want to have an influence on countries in Europe. Yes, very interestingly, I don't think that people pay too much attention to this, although it is quite obvious. If you have a conflict with the US in the maritime sphere, which is a very, very probable conflict that might arise, then you want to make sure that your goods can be transported to Europe if Europe is actually willing to still buy your goods, and by buying your goods is willing to side with you against the US rather than siding with the US against you, right? So that is the reason why we need a continental new Silk Road that establishes a connection between China and Europe by train, which replaces then the reliance on the maritime connection between China, the Mediterranean, and Europe. Right? And so, of course, I think what we are observing at this moment is a gradual process of globalization, which is driven by the growing mistrust between China and the US. And the more we have a problem here, the more other places in the world will try to reorganize their supply chains, and this implies that they try to reorganize the way they deal with the globalization, or the way by which they have dealt with the globalization during the last 40 years.
I have a couple of questions basically about agency. So, for instance, there's one question: do you think a new president of the US could change the decoupling and tensions between China and the US? So, counterfactually speaking, if we think about different big players at the moment, and probably not just the US president, but others as well, would that make a difference, or are structural forces that strong and they point almost inadvertently into the wrong direction?
I personally tend to look at structural forces as being very important in providing decision makers with options. But which option we take is finally decided by the decision makers. So it's an agency question from my point of view. And unfortunately, according to my understanding, I'm not a specialist of US policies, but of course, as someone who is focused on China, I've always have to look at the US. And according to my understanding, the elite in the US is divided enormously, but not on the question that they regard China as their main enemy. And for that reason, I don't think, no matter whether Trump will win the next elections or Joe Biden, I think they finally are very clear, both of them, that their main enemy is the US. Maybe they will have a slightly different way of dealing with their friends, for example, with Europe. And maybe it will be easier for the US leadership to win over support from Europe against China without Trump as their leader. But the fact that they have already decided that China is their main enemy, I think is crystal clear. And for that reason, maybe the form they are using in communicating with each other and with their friends will change, but not this basic policy.
We are nearing the end slowly but surely, but I'd just like to ask a few short questions that I still see on the Facebook stream and that I still see on Zoom. There was one question, and Susanne, if you allow, I'll just do three now to bundle those questions. There was one on the Chinese diaspora. So does the Chinese government try to use the Chinese diaspora to spread its narrative? That was one question. The second question was about possible mediator roles between the US and China. So what non-state actors was the question? International organizations or non-governmental organizations could play this kind of role. And yeah, I think in a way I summarized it, so that's it. So it would be these two questions, Susanne. So the first one about the mediators, state and non-state actors, and the other one about the diaspora.
Okay. Allow me to start with the diaspora question. Very interesting question. Vienna is one of those places where we have many people from China living together with us, and it is always interesting to see how the diaspora actually reacts to certain situations. One of my PhD students wrote his PhD on online communication among Chinese living in Vienna, and he compared non-crisis situation with crisis situation. And was very interesting that the whole way people communicated via a website that is provided by non-state actors, Chinese living in Vienna, they were very, very friendly. They wanted to understand Austria. They wanted to integrate themselves into the situation in Austria. Everything was fine. The moment the 2008 crisis broke out, the 2008 crisis is the crisis in Tibet that actually unfolded before the Olympic Games in China. And when this crisis came up, the whole mood, the whole climate of discussion, everything that you could read in the internet about how people within the Chinese community actually communicated with each other changed dramatically. So very interestingly, we can see that this one example at least tells us that in times of crisis, there is a tendency among the Chinese diaspora, and I'm not saying whether the Chinese government wants this to happen, yes or not, this is another question I'm going to talk about in a minute. So the moment we come across a crisis, the Chinese diaspora tends to listen to what they're being told in Beijing rather to what they're being told in their respective countries. So for example, I know many people, Chinese, living in Vienna, and with regard to the lockdown of Vienna, they behave as if they were in Wuhan and not as if they were in Vienna. So this means they learned how to react to this crisis by listening to the Chinese government in Beijing rather than to the Austrian government in Vienna. And I think this is something we can talk about for hours and hours. What is the reason behind this? And I think it only shows us that our efforts to integrate a multicultural society are still much too small. And in times of crisis, at least these people listen to their Beijing government rather than the government of their respective country. And of course, this also implies that the Chinese government then knows that in times of crisis, it at least thinks it can count on the diaspora all around the world. And this again then makes conflicts enormously sharp. I mean, now we here in Austria, we don't have really big problems, but in the US, there are really more and more violent conflicts between individuals so far, Chinese individuals and non-Chinese individuals. But I think this is already a very, very bad sign that the conflict between the US and China will then eventually also be transported in all those society where we have very high numbers of Chinese migrants. This is true especially for Australia, for the US, and for New Zealand, but also for the UK and other countries in Europe, especially in France. So this was your number one question. Number two question was, okay, non-state actors. At this moment, I think we are in a very precarious situation because as the US is sort of pulling out of most of the UN organizations that might sort of help us to find mediation in this very conflictual situation. The other side of the conflict, which is China, is actually trying to fill the void that the US is actually leaving by pulling out of these organizations. And the other day I was asked about the WHO. Well, the WHO is a wonderful organization. I do research in public health policy in China, and I know what the WHO has actually done for China to develop in a situation where, for example, millions and millions of people living in the countryside finally have at least a basic coverage of their expenditures in the field of healthcare. So I'm the last one to say, you know, WHO is a terrible organization and nobody has to supply them with any money anymore because they're only doing rubbish. No, I'm not saying this. But on the other hand, I also know, because I do research in this field, that the Chinese influence in this organization has grown enormously, and that the general secretary of this organization wouldn't be the general secretary of this organization without the support of China. And this implies that all these organizations that maybe could help us in finding mediation in this conflict are organizations that are already part of the conflict. They are part and parcel of this conflict, and they are not mediators. So in this situation, it is so difficult to find someone who understands enough of both sides, and to find an organization that has the capacity to actually talk to both sides and try to mediate in the situation. If you look, for example, at the understanding of European politicians about the situation in China, it's so low that, you know, you can't expect them to do the right thing in the right situation. And I'm not the one to judge how much they understand about the situation in the US. I can only hope that they understand more about the US than they understand about China. And as they understand very little about China, it's extremely difficult to mediate, because this is a very, very difficult political, economic, and cultural situation. And I don't see at this moment where the non-state actors in form of an organization could be that could handle the situation.
Susanne, thank you very, very, very much for all of those insights. I greatly enjoyed it. I myself, as some of you watching this know all too well, especially my poor students, I'm a rather abstract theoretical thinker, and I'm really always very happy to get the kind of in-depth knowledge that only area specialists have. And obviously having in-depth knowledge about China in our days is something that's very, very precious. So it was really a fantastic talk. Thank you so much.